Welcome to Mystic Dragon Chronicles, where every tale holds a lesson. Beyond fantasy, lesson that last. Let's step into the story.
The transport did not crash loudly. It just fell. It came in slow and sideways, scraping the frozen ground outside Outpost Verith 9 like a tired animal dropping to its knees. No explosion, no distress signal, just the long metallic groan of a ship that had given everything it had and had nothing left. Reed Calloway heard it from inside Lab 3, where he had been labeling samples of Rim Sector moss for the last 2 hours. He set his stylus down, looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then went outside. The transport was a Conclave cargo hauler. Old model. The kind used for moving things nobody wanted to think too hard about. It had skidded about 40 meters and stopped against a ridge of rock. The hull was dented but intact. No crew inside. It had been running on automated pilot. Reed walked around it twice. There was a manifest panel near the rear door. He read it. Biological samples. Mineral cores. Administrative waste. One sealed container, listed at the bottom under a category that simply said, Authorized Disposal. The container had a number, not a name. He was about to go back inside when he heard the sound. It was small. A dry, clicking noise. Like something tapping from inside a box. Reed stood still. He listened. It came again. He found the container near the back of the hold. It was about the size of a large storage crate, sealed with conclave locks, and it had a datapad attached to the outside. He read the datapad first. Hatchling designation, Saurial. Species, dragon, sovereign bloodline. Classification, dim. No elemental breath signature detected. Wing development below minimum threshold. No viable growth projection. By order of Grand Elder Savras, disposal authorized. Reed read it twice. Then he broke the seal and opened the container. She was the size of a large dog. Pale silver gold scales, so thin they looked like old paper. Her wings were folded against her sides, too small for her body even at this size. Her eyes were closed. She was breathing, barely, in short, shallow pulls. She looked like something the galaxy had decided was not worth the space it took up. Reed reached in and picked her up. She woke fast and bit him. Her teeth were small but sharp, and she caught the side of his left hand well enough to draw blood. He did not drop her. He just adjusted his grip and held on while she thrashed, hissing through her nose, eyes wild with fear. Hey, he said, not loudly, just a word. Hey, it's okay. She did not understand him. She kept struggling. He held on. By the time he carried her inside, she had stopped fighting, though not because she had calmed down. She was just too weak to keep going. She hung in his arms with her eyes fixed on him, breathing hard, watching him the way something watches a thing it does not yet know is safe. Dova was waiting at the inner door. Dova was an avian, tall, feathered, with sharp yellow eyes that currently looked like they were about to fall out of her head. Reed, she said. She was in a disposal container, Reed said. Reed. She's alive. She is a dragon, Dova said. A conclave sovereign bloodline dragon. You cannot pick up a conclave sovereign bloodline dragon from a disposal container and walk inside with her. She bit me, Reed said, looking at his hand. Can you get the med kit? Dova stared at him for a long, painful moment. Then she went to get the med kit. He set the little dragon down on the examination table in Lab 1. She immediately tried to crawl off the edge. He caught her. She hissed at him. He set her back. She tried again. He caught her again. They did this 4 times. On the 5th attempt she made it to the edge, looked down at the floor, looked back at him, and then very slowly crawled back to the middle of the table and lay down. She tucked her nose under her own tail and watched him with pale eyes that were starting to look less terrified and more suspicious. He took that as progress. Dova bandaged his hand and then stood with her arms folded, reading the datapad from the container. She read it in silence. Then she said, the Conclave authorized her disposal. That means she is, technically, Conclave property, and we have just picked her up and brought her inside. The outpost log will show a recovery, Reed said. I'll file it as a xenobiological find. She is not a xenobiological find. She is a dragon. She is a living thing that was in a disposal container, Reed said. He was cleaning the bite mark on his hand, not looking up. She's not going back in one. Dova was quiet. The little dragon had closed her eyes. She was still breathing in those short, shallow pulls, but they were slower now. Less panicked. Reed looked at her for a long moment. "She's just scared," he said, mostly to himself. "Wouldn't you be?" He logged the recovery that evening. The signal went out through standard channels, as all station logs did, broadcast across the RIM relay network, and from there into the wider Conclave grid. Somewhere far from Verith 9, in a building Reed had never seen, a small flag appeared in a database next to the number that used to be Soriel's only name. Reed did not know about the flag. He was in Lab 1, sitting on the floor next to the examination table, talking quietly to a dragon who could not understand him yet, making sure she knew he was still there. Before he turned off the light, he said it once. Not dramatically, not to make a point, just because it was true and she was small and the galaxy had already decided she did not matter. "I'm not throwing you away." She opened one pale eye, looked at him, closed it again. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the first night she slept without flinching. 3 months after the night Reed brought her in, Soriel was still alive. In the Conclave's own medical literature, this was not supposed to happen. Dim hatchlings, those born without elemental signature, with undersized wings and below-threshold aura readings, had a recorded survival rate past 60 days of exactly 0. They faded. The Conclave said it was biology. They said the body simply could not sustain itself without an active element. What the Conclave did not say, because they had never thought to study it, was that every single dim hatchling in their records had been alone. Soriel was not alone. She was, at this point, a significant problem for Outpost Verith 9's filing system. Reed had entered her into the station's biological study log as Subject S1, Rim Sector Fauna, unclassified. His station chief, a tired man named Forsyth who worked remotely from Central Command, had sent 4 increasingly urgent messages about this. Reed had replied to each one with updated study notes and a request for additional nutrient supplements. Forsyth had approved the supplements, because he was not sure what else to do. Soriel ate them without enthusiasm. She ate most things without enthusiasm unless Reed put them in front of her directly, and even then she would eye him for a moment first, a long, measuring look, before she decided to eat. Dova said this was dominance behavior. Reed said he thought she just liked to check that he was still there. Dova said those might be the same thing. The little dragon followed Reed through the station. Not closely at first. She would stop at doorways and wait, watching him go through, and then decide after a moment to follow. She had not bitten him again. She had, however, bitten Forsyth's holographic projection once, which had confused everyone including Soriel, who had looked at her own teeth with visible disappointment when they passed through nothing. Reed had started talking to her. It had begun practically, explaining what he was doing while he worked, because he found silence uncomfortable and she was always nearby. But it had become something else. He talked to her the way some people talk to themselves, except she listened. She did not understand the words, but she turned her head at the changes in his voice, and when he described something that made him laugh, she would watch his face and her ears, small and tucked back, would shift forward slightly, as if she was trying to understand the shape of it. When he went out on the 3-day field survey in week 9, she stopped eating. He found out when he returned, and Dova met him at the door with an expression that had, "I am not going to say I told you so" written all over it, and then said, "She has not eaten in 62 hours. She sat at the airlock door for the first day." Reed went directly to Lab 1. Soriel was under the examination table, curled tight, her pale scales dull again the way they had been in the disposal container. She heard his footsteps and went very still. He sat down on the floor, not next to her, just in the room. He started talking. It took about 4 minutes before she crept out and pressed herself against his leg. He did not make a big moment of it. He just kept talking, one hand resting gently on her back, and after a while she ate half a nutrient block and then fell asleep on his feet, which made standing up again extremely complicated. He did not go on another field survey alone after that. The Conclave's first message arrived in week 10. It was polite. It acknowledged the recovery log, noted that the hatchling in question had been properly classified for disposal under Conclave's Sovereign Bloodline Protocol 7, and requested either the return of the hatchling or confirmation that disposal had been carried out. Reed filed a response. Request declined. Hatchling designated S1 is under active xenobiological study and presenting unprecedented survival data in controlled observation. Transfer would compromise research integrity. Forsyth called him directly for the first time in 6 months. Read, Forsyth said, in the voice of a man staring at consequences he had not budgeted for. You cannot just. The Conclave is not a form you decline. I used the RIM Accord Research Protection Clause, Reed said. Subsection 4. Ongoing study of a novel biological phenomenon. A dragon is not a novel biological phenomenon. A dim dragon surviving past 90 days with no recorded precedent in the Conclave's own database is, Reed said. Dova found the data. I can send you the citations. He sent the citations. Forsyth did not respond for 2 days. Dova, for her part, had fallen down a research tunnel she had not meant to fall into. She had started looking into the Conclave's records on dim dragons purely to build the case Reed needed. What she found instead made her go very quiet for an afternoon. Every dim dragon in the Conclave's history died young, she told Reed that evening. Every one. But it was not from weakness. They were all abandoned within days of classification. Some were sent to disposal. Some were simply left. None of them had any consistent care. None of them had anyone who stayed. Reed looked at Soriel, who was asleep on the warming pad in the corner. What does that mean? He asked. I don't know yet, Dova said. But I think I've been asking the wrong question. I kept looking for what was wrong with them. She paused. Maybe nothing was wrong with them. That night, the power coupling in Lab 2 failed. It was a small emergency, brief, manageable, over in minutes, but for about 30 seconds the lights went out, and the station made the low warning sound it made when systems cut over to backup. Soriel woke. Her eyes went wide. And then, in the dark, she exhaled. Not fire, not frost, not anything Reed had a name for. A shimmer, like heat haze, but cold, like the air itself had briefly bent sideways. It lasted 1 second. Then it was gone. The lights came back on. Soriel looked at her own nose with an expression of complete confusion. Reed had his datapad out before the lights had fully steadied. He wrote for a long time that night, more than he had written in months. The second Conclave message arrived 2 weeks later. This one was not from a diplomatic office. It was from an individual. The name listed was Rail, Conclave Enforcement Division, Sovereign Bloodline Affairs. It did not ask. It informed. The hatchling is sovereign Conclave property. Her bloodline remains classified regardless of developmental status. Humans have no legal authority over Conclave biological assets. This matter will be resolved. The next communication will not be through official channels. Reed read it, set his datapad down, looked at Soriel, who was watching him from across the room, reading his face the way she had learned to do. He picked the datapad back up and wrote another entry in the study log. Subject S1, Day 94. Scales showing first signs of iridescence. Appetite improving. Produced unclassified elemental event. Duration approximate 1 second. Trigger likely stress response. Further observation required. He did not write anything about the message from Rail. There was nothing to write. His answer had not changed. Rail arrived in orbit on a Tuesday. Reed knew it was a Tuesday because he had been trying to fix the water recycler in Section C for 3 days, which meant it was definitely a Tuesday. He was halfway under the access panel, tools spread around him, when Dova leaned in the doorway and said, "There is a Conclave diplomatic vessel requesting docking clearance." Reed said, "Tell them the docking arm is broken." "It is not broken." "It could be." Dova looked at him. Reed. He came out from under the panel. He was dusty and he had a grease mark across one forearm, and he looked exactly like a person who had been fixing a water recycler, which was not the look one usually brought to a negotiation with a Conclave enforcer. He considered changing his clothes. Then he decided it was probably fine. The Sovereign Grace was a mid-sized diplomatic vessel, clean and white, and precisely the kind of ship designed to make the people inside it feel important. Rail met him in the docking reception bay. He was tall. Most Conclave officials were, with the narrow build of a species that had been eating well for a very long time. His uniform had a lot of insignia on it. He looked at Reed's grease mark without saying anything, which was somehow worse than if he had. "Xenobiologist Calloway," Rail said. He said it the way someone says a word they have had to look up. "That's me," Reed said. "You have in your possession a hatchling of the dragon's sovereign bloodline. Classified dim. Designated for disposal under Conclave Protocol 7. You have declined 2 official requests for her return." Rail paused. "I am here to correct that." "Okay," Reed said. Rail waited. Okay, he repeated. I heard you, Reed said. She's not going back. There was a silence. Rail had prepared for several things. He had prepared for argument, for negotiation, for a request about compensation or official recognition or career protections. He had a list. A human refusing, without any apparent calculation, was not on the list. You understand, Rail said carefully, that Conclave sanctions against the human research presence on the rim would significantly impact your entire program. Not just this outpost. All of them. I understand, Reed said. And you still refuse. She's not going back, Reed said again. Same tone. Same speed. Like he was reading from something he had already decided a long time ago. Rail looked at him with the expression of someone trying to find the angle they had missed. Why, he asked. And for a moment, under the official weight of the question, he sounded almost genuinely confused. Why would a human risk this much for a dim dragon? There is no benefit. She has no power. She has no future in our hierarchy. She is, by every metric we use, worthless. Reed considered the question seriously. He did not answer fast. I told her she wasn't going to be thrown away, he said at last. And I meant it. Rail stared at him. That is your reason, Rail said. That's my reason. A promise. To a hatchling who cannot understand language. She understands more than you think, Reed said. And it wouldn't matter if she didn't. I said it. I meant it. That's all. Rail was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he would grant a 30-day extension while the Conclave's legal office reviewed the Rim Accord clause Reed had invoked. The words were formal, but the look on his face was something Reed had not expected, not anger. Something more like standing at the edge of a concept he had no framework for. Reed thanked him. They shook hands. Reed's species did that. Rail accepted it without comment. And then Reed walked back through the docking arm and back to his outpost. When he came through the inner door, Soriel was sitting exactly where she had been sitting since he boarded the Sovereign Grace. In the middle of the corridor, 5 meters from the docking arm entrance, facing the door. She was 6 months old now. Her scales had shifted, not bright yet, but no longer dull. There was a faint iridescence at the edges, like the inside of a shell. Her wings had grown enough that she folded them in layers when she sat, the way birds tucked their feathers. She still could not fly. She could, however, run surprisingly fast when she wanted to, and she had learned 31 words in Human Standard, which Reed knew because Dova had been keeping count. When he walked in, she rose to her feet, and then she made a sound. It was not the hiss she had started with. It was not a growl. It was low and long, and it moved through the floor as much as the air, and it settled in Reed's chest like something warm. He did not have a word for what it was. He had stopped trying to find one. He sat down on the floor. She put her head against his shoulder and breathed slowly. He told her what had happened. All of it. She could not follow the words, but she watched his face and her ears move through every shift in his voice, reading him the way she had learned to read him. Not the language, but the person. Dova found him there 10 minutes later and leaned in the doorway with her arms folded. She found something in the old archives, Dova said. About dim dragons. About what they were becoming. What do you mean, becoming? Reed asked. There is a recorded case. 300 years ago. A dim hatchling whose handler refused to give her up, the way you've refused. Dova paused. In the records, just before her death, because they did take her in the end, she was developing something the Conclave called void resonance. They logged it as a symptom of decline. Reed looked at Soriel. He thought about the shimmer in the dark, the air bending sideways for one cold second. What if it wasn't, he said. Dova looked at him. That is exactly what I keep asking. She straightened up. I think we need to find Instructor Ophel. Who is that? A retired scholar. She spent 200 years studying dim dragon biology before the Conclave cut her funding. Dova's voice was dry. She was told there was nothing worth studying. Soriel lifted her head and looked between them. Her pale gold eyes caught the light and held it for a moment, and the air around her edges shimmered faintly. Not the full shimmer from the emergency, just a suggestion of it, like the start of something that had not yet decided what it was going to be. Reed watched it until it faded. Then he said, Find her. Instructor Ophel was not difficult to find. She was difficult to convince. She lived on a small research station 2 relay jumps from Vareth 9, alone except for her notes and a deep, settled bitterness about the Conclave that she wore the way some people wore comfortable old coats. She was insectoid, compact, with 6 arms she used with efficient precision, and she had spent 200 years of her life studying a subject that the galactic scientific community considered a waste of time. When Dova's message arrived, she read it 4 times before she replied. Her reply said, "What did the shimmer look like?" Dova described it. Cold, not hot. Air bending sideways rather than outward. Duration 1 second under stress. Ophal's second reply said, "I will be there in 8 days." She arrived in 7, walking through the docking arm with a bag of data cores and an expression that suggested she was reserving judgment on absolutely everything. She met Reed in the corridor. She looked him up and down. "You are the human," she said. "Reed Calloway," he said. "You have kept this hatchling alive for 6 months by talking to her and refusing to comply with official communications." "That's roughly accurate," Reed said. Ophel made a sound that might have been approval. "Take me to her." Soriel was in Lab 1 when they entered. She heard Ophel's footsteps, a different pattern, new, and rose immediately, wings half spread, watching the doorway with the full alert posture she used for things she had not yet decided about. Reed came through the door first, and she visibly relaxed, wings lowering. Then she watched Ophel. Ophel stood still in the doorway for almost a full minute. She did not make any sudden moves. She simply looked at Soriel with the focused attention of someone seeing a thing they had spent decades theorizing about. Then she said, very quietly, "She is not dim." The Conclave classified her as, Dova started. "The Conclave," Ophel said, "has been wrong about this for 1,000 years." She stepped into the room slowly. Soriel tracked her. Dim is a classification the Conclave invented to describe hatchlings who produce no standard elemental signature at birth. Fire, ice, lightning, storm, the known elements. These hatchlings produce none of them. She paused. They called it a defect. It is not a defect. It is a different kind of beginning. She explained it the way she had spent 200 years figuring it out and had never once gotten to say out loud. A standard dragon's element was fixed at birth. It came in fast and bright, and the Conclave measured it and ranked it, and that was that. But in very rare cases, not defects, not failures, a hatchling was born without a fixed element because their body was building something that had no fixed category. Something that could bend the energy of other elements rather than produce one of its own. Absorb it, redirect it, cancel it out, or amplify it, depending on need. The Conclave called it void resonance when they found traces of it in their old records. They had decided it was a symptom of dying. They had never once considered that they were looking at it too late, after abandonment had already started the decline. Void resonance does not develop without stability, Ophel said. Without consistent presence. Without what your species would call, she paused, working through her vocabulary in human standard, being kept, being witnessed. She looked at Reed directly. The Conclave policy of exile has been killing the variability they would have valued most. For 1,000 years. The room was quiet for a moment. Reed looked at Soriel. Soriel looked back at him. Her scales had a deep shimmer now, even at rest, not a flash but a constant low iridescence, like starlight trapped in silver. "Yes," Ophel said, "and you gave it to her without knowing what it was." "How do we help her grow it?" he asked. Ophel almost smiled. "That is the right question." What followed was not dramatic. Training with Soriel was slow and careful and full of setbacks. Ophel did not use force or pressure. She sat with Soriel the way Reed sat with her, at floor level, patient, consistent, and she used a small energy emitter to produce controlled pulses that Soriel could learn to feel and then respond to. The first week, nothing happened. The second week, Soriel produced the shimmer twice. Brief, uncontrolled, gone in seconds. The third week, she held it for 4 seconds and bent the light around Reed's right hand so completely that it vanished from sight. Everyone in the room stared at the invisible hand. Soriel looked extremely proud of herself. Reed stared at the space where his hand was not and said, "Okay, that's genuinely impressive." Soriel puffed up. Dova wrote it in the log. 2 weeks later, during a routine system calibration, there was a power surge in the station's grid. One of the capacitors in the main line blew, and for about 3 seconds a full electrical overload was cascading toward the crew quarters. Reed was moving for the emergency shutoff when the air cracked with a sound like a rope pulled tight. Soriel had stepped into the corridor between the surge and the quarters. She stood with her legs braced and her eyes wide, and her whole body shaking with effort, and she absorbed it. All of it. The overload went into her and stayed there, dispersed, gone. She stood for another moment after it was over. Then she sat down very heavily on the floor and looked at her own front claws. Then she looked at Reed. He crossed the corridor and sat down next to her, and she put her head against him and breathed, and he rested his hand on her side and felt the heat radiating off her from the effort. "Good girl," he said, quietly, the way he had been saying things to her since she was small enough to hold. She rumbled. It was 2 days after this that the Conclave's 30-day extension expired. Rail did not send a message this time. The station sensors showed his ship returning to orbit, and this time it was not alone. 2 Conclave warships came with it. Long, dark-armed. Forsyth called. He was not pretending to be calm anymore. "Reed, there are 2 Conclave warships in orbit above you." "I see them," Reed said. "What are you going to do?" Reed looked out the observation window at the dark shapes against the stars. Then he looked back at Soriel, who had come to stand beside him and was also looking at the ships, her pale eyes steady. "I'm going to go file the RIM Accord Emergency Research Protection Claim," Reed said. Subsection 9. Rare biological phenomenon under active critical development. Threat of irreversible loss. "Will that work?" "It'll buy time," Reed said. He filed it. It bought time. Not much. But Ophel, reviewing the footage of the power surge, said nothing for a very long while. Then she said, "She should not be able to do that yet. What she did in that corridor, that is not 6-month development. That is not even 6-year development." She looked at Reed. "She is growing faster than anything I modeled." Reed said, "Is that good?" Ophel said, "It means you were right to keep her. It also means the Conclave is going to want her very badly now." A pause. "And it means someone else has been watching these logs more closely than we knew." As if to confirm it, a new signal came through on the station's private channel that evening. Not from Rail. Not from Forsyth. The sender identification read, "Savras, Grand Elder, Dragon Conclave High Seat." The message was 2 sentences. "I have reviewed the records. Do not move the hatchling." Reed stared at it for a long time. He showed it to no one. He went back to Lab 1, where Soriel had fallen asleep on the warming mat, still giving off faint heat from the afternoon's work. He sat next to her and thought about what 2 sentences from the most powerful dragon alive might mean. He decided it meant one thing. At minimum, somebody was paying attention now. Nobody slept well the night the warships arrived in orbit. The 2 Conclave vessels hung above Vareth 9 like dark parentheses, and the station's external sensors tracked them in real time on a feed that nobody had asked to be displayed in the common room, but that nobody turned off either. The crew moved around it quietly, eating their meals in front of it, not saying much. Soriel was not small anymore. She was roughly the size of a large horse, and her silver-gold scales had deepened into something genuinely striking. A layered iridescence that caught any light in a room and bent it, soft prismatic colors shifting at her edges whenever she moved. Her wings had grown enough to be functional, though long flights still tired her. She could hold a void shimmer for over a minute. She could redirect a directed energy pulse with clean precision. She had, at Ophel's quiet suggestion, started practicing the way she listened, turning it inward, reading the energy signatures of systems around her the way she had learned to read Reed's voice. She was, in the words of Ophel's most recent log entry, categorically unprecedented. None of that mattered to Rail. He came down from the Sovereign Grace the next morning with 4 armored enforcers at his back. They did not ask for docking clearance. They used the Conclave's legal authority over the station's systems and opened the docking arm themselves. It was a message as much as an action. Reed called a station meeting first. He gathered all 11 people on Vareth 9's current rotation in the common room and told them exactly what was happening. He did not make it dramatic. He just laid it out. The Conclave had enforcement authority, 2 warships, and a legal claim that most courts in the galaxy would uphold without question. Anyone who wanted to leave before Rail came through the door could go. He would record it as an emergency personnel evacuation. No one would lose their position. No questions. He said it, and then he waited. Nobody moved. Dova, standing at the back of the room with her arms folded, said, "We are not giving her back." She said it in the flat, factual tone she used for things she was not interested in debating. One by one, around the room, People nodded. Reed looked at all of them for a moment. He did not say thank you, because he did not know how to say it for something this size. He just nodded once and said, "Okay." That night, Soriel found him. She had gotten too large for the laboratory a month ago, so she used the maintenance bay at the back of the station, which had a high ceiling and a wide floor and a heating element Reed had installed in the wall. She came to his quarters instead, though, moving through the corridor sideways because her wingspan needed the space, and she nosed the door open and stood in the doorway until he looked up. He moved from the desk to the floor. She came in and curled around him. She was much too large for this to be comfortable for either of them, but she arranged herself carefully, her side against his back, her head lowered to just beside his. She had done this when she was small enough to sit in his lap. She did not stop doing it just because she had grown. She made the sound, the low one, the one that had started as relief and had become, over months, something that sounded like trust made into noise. "I know," Reed said. "I know you understand what's happening." She rumbled, slow and steady. "They're going to try tomorrow," he said. "And I'm going to be here. Okay, I'm right here. That part doesn't change." She shifted, the way she did when she was settling in. Reed leaned back against her side. She was warm. She always ran warm now. Since the electrical surge, Ophel said the void energy had altered something in her baseline metabolism. "I told you," he said quietly. "Not getting thrown away. Not by me." She pressed her head gently against his. He did not sleep for a long time, but he was calm. Rail and the 4 enforcers came through the docking arm at 0800 station time. They were in full Conclave enforcement gear, armored, armed, carrying signal emitters designed to suppress and disorient large biological targets. Standard equipment for difficult extractions. They found the corridor blocked. Not by personnel, not by a barricade, by Soriel, who stood in the middle of the central corridor with her wings folded and her head level, facing the docking arm entrance, and simply did not move. Rail stopped. The enforcers stopped behind him. They activated the suppression emitters. Nothing happened. The emitters hummed and put out exactly no effect on anything in range. Rail checked his unit. It showed active signal. The signal was going nowhere. Soriel had not moved. She was shaking, a fine, deep tremor through her whole body, but she held the void field steady. Every weapon signature, every scanner, every targeting system within 40 meters had gone completely silent. The corridor was a dead zone, and she was the reason. Rail looked at her. She looked back at him. In the 2 months since he had first come to this station to retrieve a dim hatchling that a human had inexplicably decided to keep, she had grown from the size of a large dog to the size of a horse. Her scales shimmered with an energy signature his equipment could not classify. She had just shut down 4 suppression units simultaneously without appearing to try, and she was shaking with the effort of it, and she still had not moved. The station comms chimed. A transmission had arrived on the station's primary channel. Cinder, Savras, Grand Elder, Dragon Conclave High Seat. The signal was live, direct. She was on the line right now. Rail heard the chime. He looked at his communicator. He looked at Soriel. He did not make a move toward her. The communicator opened. Savras's voice filled the corridor, old and deep, and carrying the particular weight of someone who had been obeyed without question for thousands of years. "Rail," she said. "Elder Savras," he said carefully. "Stand down." A pause. Very short. "Yes, Elder Savras." Soriel did not lower the field immediately. She watched the enforcers take a step back. She watched Rail's posture change. Then, slowly, she let it go. The shimmer at her edges faded. The suppression units blinked back online and immediately began reading a void resonance signature in the immediate area that was so far off their calibration charts that they simply returned error codes. Soriel stayed where she was in the corridor, still trembling faintly from the effort. Reed came through the door from the side passage and walked past Rail without a word. He stopped next to Soriel and put one hand flat on her side. She turned her head and looked at him, and her breath came out in a long, slow exhale. On the open comms channel, Savras was still there. When she spoke again, she was not speaking to Rail. "Xenobiologist Calloway," she said. "Yes," Reed said. "I have been watching your station logs for 11 weeks. A pause. I wish to speak with you formally. You will come before the Grand Court." It was not a question. Reed looked at Soriel. She looked back at him, pale gold eyes steady, still shaking a little, still solid as anything he had ever known. "I'll come," he said. Soriel pressed against his side, and the light in the corridor bent around her edges, and for a moment the whole station was quiet, and something had shifted, not just in the corridor, not just in the station, somewhere in the long calculations of a galaxy that had spent 1,000 years believing it knew exactly how much a dim dragon was worth. The Conclave enforcers who came to escort Reed to the Grand Court were professional and polite, and completely unprepared for Soriel. She was sitting on top of his transport when they arrived. Not inside it. On top of it. Folded neatly, wings tucked, with the settled posture of someone who had thought about this and reached a clear conclusion. Two enforcers looked at each other. One of them checked his orders. His orders said nothing about this. Reed came out of the station with his bag and looked up at her. "You can't sit on the transport," he said. She looked down at him. "They need to fly it," he said. She did not move. Reed stood there for a moment. Then he looked at the enforcers and said, "Is there a larger ship?" There was a larger ship. Soriel rode in the cargo bay, which she filled almost completely. Reed sat against her side for the entire journey, and she slept with her head across his legs, and the enforcers in the forward section did not say anything about any of this, because sometimes a situation presents itself so far outside the training manual that the only reasonable approach is to let it happen. The Grand Court of the Dragon Conclave was built to be overwhelming. It was a vast circular chamber, high-ceilinged and ancient, and the seats that rose in tiers around its center were filled with dragons in their formal aspects, not shifted to bipedal court forms, but full, present, in their natural shape, scaled and enormous and old. There were dozens of them. The smallest in the room was still 4 times the size of Soriel. Soriel walked in beside Reed and stood at his shoulder and looked at none of them with anything approaching fear. She looked curious, if anything. She had learned, over the last several months, that the things that meant to harm her did not usually announce themselves with high ceilings and formal lighting. Reed stood in the center of the floor, in the ring of light that marked where the conclave wished the person being examined to stand. He was a xenobiologist from a mid-tier species, still wearing his practical station clothes because nobody had told him there was a dress code, and he looked at the assembled power of the Dragon Conclave the way he looked at most things, steadily, without hurry. Savras was in the highest seat. She was immense and pale-scaled, platinum and deep gold, ancient, with eyes that had been watching things happen for longer than some civilizations had existed. She looked at Reed for a long moment before she spoke. "You are aware," she said, "that this court convenes to address the unauthorized custody of a conclave sovereign hatchling, that you defied official communications, that you invoked treaty protections in ways our legal office found frustrating, that you refused, on multiple occasions, to comply with a senior enforcement officer." "Yes," Reed said. "Explain yourself," she said, not unkindly, just the weight of the question, placed in front of him, waiting. Reed thought for a moment, not because he did not know what to say, because he wanted to say it correctly. "She was alive," he said. "She was in a disposal container, and she was alive, and she needed someone to not give up on her. I didn't know what void resonance was. I didn't know what she'd become. I didn't think about what she'd grow into." He paused. "She was small and she was scared, and I told her she was safe. All I did after that was make sure I meant it." The chamber was quiet. One of the elder dragons in the upper seat said, in a tone that suggested considerable skepticism, "You expect this court to accept that a human kept a sovereign hatchling out of sentiment?" "I don't expect anything," Reed said. "You asked me to explain myself. That's the explanation." The court deliberated. It took some time. There was visible disagreement. Some dragons wanted Soriel transferred regardless, wanted the research but not the human attached to it, wanted to draw a line about what non-conclave species were permitted to do with sovereign bloodline hatchlings. Some wanted to simply grant Reed some kind of minor official title and call the situation resolved. Savras listened to all of it. She said nothing until the deliberation slowed. Then she said, "I authorized the disposal." The chamber went quiet in a different way. "I read the hatchling's assessment," she said. "I saw dim. I followed protocol. I did not look further." A pause that carried the particular weight of someone who had been right about almost everything for thousands of years and was deciding how to hold being wrong. "Void resonance has not appeared in our bloodline in 4,000 years. I believed it was extinct. We believed it was extinct. Another pause. We extinguished it ourselves. Every dim hatchling our protocol removed, every one of them might have been this. We will never know how many. No one spoke. The human kept his word to a hatchling the Conclave had discarded, Savras said. And in doing so he preserved something we had been destroying for a millennium without knowing it. She looked at Reed. Not with warmth, exactly. Something more complex than warmth. The look of someone recalibrating. I invoke the Keeper Bond provision. Ancient statute. A non-dragon who forms an irrevocable developmental bond with a sovereign hatchling during the critical growth period may be formally recognized as bonded keeper. The bond is legal, binding, and cannot be dissolved by conclave order. The vote was called. It passed. Rael, standing at the side of the chamber, looked at the floor for a long moment. Then he looked at Reed. Then he looked at Soriel, who had been watching the entire proceeding with her head tilted, following the tones of voices, if not all the words. He said nothing, but the look on his face was the look of someone who had spent years enforcing a system and was, quietly, starting to think about it differently. They returned to Verith 9 2 days later. The observation deck of the station was not large. Soriel filled most of it. She lay with her legs folded beneath her, wings spread slightly to catch the passive heat from the station's exterior panels, and the stars beyond the viewport were reflected in her scales and bent there, broken into soft prismatic fragments that washed across the walls and ceiling in slow color. Reed sat beside her, not touching, for once, just sitting in the same space, the way people sit together when they do not need to be doing anything specific. She lowered her head until it was at his level. He rested one hand on her snout, the way he had done since she was small enough to hold in both arms. She rumbled. Low, slow, steady. The sound that had started as something almost involuntary, a small thing releasing tension, and had become, over months, and then over a year, something she chose. Something she did because she meant it. The whole galaxy is going to want to study you now, Reed said. Her pale gold eye slid sideways to look at him. Ophal's already written to 4 different research institutions, he said. The Conclave's academic division sent a request this morning. Someone from the Sovereign University of Kareth wants to do a biography. A biography, Soriel. Of you. You're 8 months old. The rumble shifted slightly. Something that was not quite a sound, not quite a word. An editorial comment. I told them, Reed said, that any research request goes through me first. He looked out at the stars. Told the biography person the same thing. A pause. Told the Conclave's academic division that access to your training sessions would require advance notice, documented intent, and my sign-off. They seemed surprised a human was setting the terms. Soriel shifted, scales catching the starlight and scattering it across the ceiling in a slow sweep of color. Reed looked at her for a moment. I told them they'd have to go through me, he said. Soriel made a sound that he had no name for and did not need one. It started low and rose and broke, and it was the first time he had heard anything like it from her. Something that, in a creature with a different shape and a different history, could only have been called a laugh. Reed smiled. Outside the viewport, the rim stretched on, vast and quiet, at the edge of a galaxy that had just run its calculations on 1 human and 1 dragon and come up with an answer it had not expected. They stayed on the observation deck until the station's cycle moved toward night. Soriel slept first, the way she always did, suddenly and completely, head dropping, breath going slow. Reed sat for a while longer in the soft prismatic light her scales threw across the dark. He had not set out to change anything. He had not set out to prove a point about humans, or about what a dim dragon was worth, or about what a promise meant when the whole galaxy was telling you to break it. He had just opened a container because he heard a sound, and stayed because he said he would. That was all. That was everything.